Could this airplane possibly be the same as this airplane? It's the Lockheed YF-12A. We're going to be talking about YF-12s, SR-71 Blackbirds, and the entire Blackbird family in this episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. Well, believe it or not, the YF-12 looks the way it does at the top in profile and at bottom in plan view, an amazing array of aerodynamic geometry and architecture of beautiful and classic aircraft. But this is the thoroughbred, the SR-71. And we're going to be talking about painting the SR-71 in tonight's episode with two paintings involving Palmdale, California. Before we get into that, let's talk about a little history. The SR-71 surveillance and photo recon role came about as an improvement and advancement on the Lockheed U-2, which was a photo recon aircraft that first flew in 1955. Highly modified, upgraded, and more powerful versions are still flying today. But the idea back in the Cold War was the need for speed. And so the ultimate iteration in the early 50s was this machine, the Republic XF-103, which never made it past mock-up stage. But the point here is that we're talking about an all-titanium delta wing hybrid turbojet ramjet powered interceptor for the United States Air Force. It was too much too soon. It took 9 years for that technology to finally catch up with reality. And this is the airplane that made it happen, the Lockheed A-12, predecessor to the YF-12 and SR-71. First flew on April 30th, 1962 at Groom Lake, Nevada. It was powered by two Pratt & Whitney J75 engines, same power plant as in the F-105 Thunder Chief and F-106 Delta Dart. The reason for this is that the Pratt & Whitney J58 power plant specified for the Blackbird family hadn't been fully developed yet. The J75 allowed the airplane to get into initial flight test. The YF-12A interceptor version first flew August 7th, 1963. Really beautiful airplane. And I should mention those little pods that you see below the engines house cameras that were taking pictures of weapon separation testing from the weapons bay and the missile bays in the lower forward fuselage. But as we come around in the chase plane here, we see the beginning of the true shape of the airplane, the delta wings. It had a ventral fin that folded sideways for takeoff and landing, and just a really elegant shape. And again, for early 1960s, this was quite the machine. And then came, as I mentioned, the SR-71, the ultimate photo recon sensor package ISR aircraft. Flew from operationally from 1965 to 1990 initially, brought back in 94 and flew to 97 and is now retired to museums. Aircraft made its first flight on December 22nd, 1964. First public showing of the Blackbird family was in September of 65 at Edwards Air Force Base with a demonstration flight mainly for the media of the YF-12A. And that was a pretty spectacular event. It was attended by all sorts of dignitaries, Air Force brass, and as I said, the international press got their first look at this beautiful new airplane. And as far as painting the Blackbird, boy, here's an example. It doesn't get too much better than this. The great Jack Lenwood, Revell cover artist, painting the SR-71 coming right at you. So let's get into it. My first SR-71 painting was for the Air Force art program. It was an assignment to paint the takeoff of the SR-71's final operational flight, a 68-minute world speed record run from Palmdale, California to Washington, D.C. And I thought, wait a minute, it's going to take off at 4:30 in the morning. I'm supposed to paint a black airplane taking off in the middle of the night. It's going to look like this. Little did I know. And the Air Force folks said, when you see it, you'll understand. Well, here's the record flight. And I should explain, they talk about 68 minutes coast to coast. Technically, yes. but the airplane did not take off and land in 68 minutes. Let me explain that. The beginning of the flight from Palmdale went out over the Pacific Ocean, turned north, flew up to San Francisco, and then connected with a KC-135Q and put on 60,000 pounds of fuel coming back down the coast, unhooked from the tanker, accelerated to Mach 3.2 at 60,000 feet, and then crossed the start gate at Ventura, California, arriving in Kansas City in 39 minutes, Kansas City to St. Louis in 6 minutes, St. Louis to Cincinnati in 8 minutes, Cincinnati to DC in 13 minutes. As it crossed the finish gate in Salisbury, Maryland, the airplane took 200 miles to decelerate and turn around and come back down into the DC area, also hitting another tanker to make the landing. And so the total time in the air was actually close to 2 hours. We sat through the initial briefings and then got to see the pilots suiting up. On the left is Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding, aircraft commander. On the right is RSO, or Reconnaissance Systems Operator, Joe J.T. Vita, the highest time SR-71 crewman with 1,400 hours in the jet. And here we can see Lieutenant Colonel Yielding getting suited up and being prepared for the pre-breathing, which the pilots go through before they board the jet. As an artist and with the group that was allowed into Plant 42 for that, to cover that mission, we got up close and personal with the airplane, got a complete walk around on the ramp. I should mention it was the middle of the night. It was a cold front had just come through. It was March and it was cold, but we persevered. And then when the crew boarded the jet, a very emotional experience, I should mention, because everyone thought this was the last flight of the airplane. No one knew that it was going to be brought back into service 4 years later, but for all involved, they were saying goodbye to the pilots, and this was the end of an era, so to speak. So we got to see the engine start. You can see the big engine start cart there on the left with the big Buick V8 that powers the Pratt & Whitney J58 with the TEB burst in the beginning that blows out a green flame when the engine ignites. It's really spectacular. And so we got to see the airplane start, and canopies closed, it taxied out to the runway. And I thought, well, now, wait a minute, I'll propose a painting on the ramp because it has floodlights and I can see everything. And this will be much more interesting than a black jet taking off in the middle of the night. Well, let's see what happened. Through the magic of Photoshop, I'm going to recreate as best I can what I experienced as the takeoff. And here's what it was. We were actually on the center line of the runway, runway 26, 12,000 foot ribbon of concrete in Palmdale. And we were at the threshold at the departure end, looking straight down the center line. But for the purpose of painting, I came out here to the side. So here's what we saw. Our escort called that the airplane was in position. I saw 3 bright white lights at the end of the runway. And then our escort said, he's rolling. And the lights started to come toward us, and they became larger. And by now we could start hearing the rumble of the engines, and the ground literally began to shake. And oh my gosh, this thing was really ripping toward us. And well, wait a minute. The center light started to raise up, and I realized that's not 3 landing lights. That's 1 landing light and 2 afterburner flames. We were looking at the afterburner flames right through the front of the engines. And at that moment, I had my painting. And there it was. That airplane went over us screaming loud. We had earplugs, of course, but passed over us about 200 feet. And it just turned to daylight. The brightness of that flame, I've exaggerated it here a bit, but that was my painting of the takeoff. And it was titled Habu's Last Hurrah. Well, the airplane arrived in DC. Covering the landing for the Air Force Art program was premier Air Force artist Keith Ferris. And this photo was taken by a young independent aviation photographer named Tony Landis at the time. I met Tony later that year, but we didn't know each other at this point, and it was just coincidental that he and I were covering the same flight with our respective disciplines. I should mention that the high-speed pass that you see here over the runway was briefed by Colonel Yielding as 1,500 feet. As Maxwell Smart used to say to the chief, would you believe 200? Well, there was a cloud cover, and what were they going to do? Ground the airplane? So the SR-71 had its last great moment. After the landing, there were appropriate ceremonies with people from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, the recipient of the airplane, the Air Force, and Lockheed. And I should mention that the gentleman in the white with the white hair and the long black coat that you see fourth from left is Ben Rich, president of the Skunk Works, and very deeply involved with Kelly Johnson in the design of the SR. When the crew was asked in a news conference what was the most difficult part of the mission, Colonel Yielding replied, "The most difficult part of the mission was getting on a United 767 and taking 5 hours to get back to Los Angeles." My second painting was a private commission for a SR-71 RSO. And here was the objective: paint the photo calibration run of an SR flying 75,000 feet over Palmdale as viewed from 5,000 feet directly above the airplane, looking straight down. Here's my painting parameters. The aircraft was on a heading of 270 degrees. The photo target was U.S. Air Force Plant 42. There was actually a calibration target painted right on the ramp. There was a cloud deck at 15,000 feet, mean sea level. The date was December 1982. The time was 8:45 in the morning. So I had winter lighting, early morning. I had everything I needed to compose the piece. And here's the painting. The SR is minimal. The painting was 18 by 36, so the airplane was about 3 inches long. And the title was Coming Home at Mach-3. Now let me explain that. The airplane was making a photo calibration run to calibrate the cameras and the sensors. And we're looking down from 80,000 feet at Palmdale, California. We were able to research this using space shuttle footage. The space shuttle had just gone into orbit a year earlier, and we were actually able to get some of the mission photos to look at the Antelope Valley. That cloud deck that you see there was a unique phenomenon we saw in the desert. You see the cloud shadows, and that's again put into place at 8:45 in the morning. So here's our here's a close-up look at Palmdale Airport. This is Plant 42 up here on the north side. And you see that little black dot right in the center of the parking area, the ramp, that's the photo calibration target. Here's a close-up of the airplane. Again, it was actually 2 7/8 inches long on the canvas. So I got to paint a miniature SR. And you notice that the number 1 engine exhaust is slightly larger than the number 2. The left-hand engine flame is just a bit longer. And this was observed from a chase pilot. And my client had asked me to please indicate that in the painting, as subtle and as small as it might be. And you can see the wisp of fuel venting from the tail vent there. So there's the painting, Coming Home. And the title is a play on words because the crewman lived in Palmdale, a suburb actually. And so he's coming back to his base as well as his hometown. It's a neat little painting. In closing, let's look at some of the highlights of the SR-71 Blackbird. It flew operationally. Information was declassified about 10 years ago. It achieved speeds of Mach 3.3, about 2,300 miles per hour, and flew at 90,000 feet. It was the fastest and highest flying production aircraft ever built. And it's the only U.S. jet airplane that will never be scrapped. All the survivors are either in storage or in museums. So this begs the question, was there ever a manned airplane that was faster than the SR-71? And the answer is yes, the X-15. However, there's one little catch. The X-15, which flew at Mach 6, was powered by a rocket engine. So there you have it, a look at speed in the 1960s and the SR-71 Blackbird family. Special thanks to my dear friend Tony Landis, the Air Force Art Program, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Flaps Flanagan. And thank you so much for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. Always a pleasure to have you on board. I'd like to have you subscribe if you haven't already. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, take care.